Well, we're here for another reading, and this is the last in Book 3. It's entitled Martha's Raven. Martha's Raven. Martha Randall lived alone in a small house in the country. It had been 5 years since her dear husband John had passed away. Now she was no longer able to work and had become very poor. Martha's life had been very hard. She felt very alone in the world. Her only living relative was her nephew, Bruce. He lived only a few miles away with his wife, Betty, and their 3 children. Bruce had a good job and was very rich, but did not bring any comfort into his aunt's life. Martha was an elderly, God-fearing woman. She had learned to trust the Lord for all things. Even though she was lonely and poor, she was content. But Bruce, with all his wealth and comfort, did not know the meaning of true happiness. He hated religion. He mocked his aunt for her simple faith in God. He could not understand how she could find so much happiness in the Lord. As winter approached, Martha's supplies became very low. Then the weather turned very cold, and a heavy snowfall made it impossible for her to go out. Each day she allowed herself to eat only as much as necessary, but the time came when she had to eat the last of her food. Her last half of a potato, together with a bit of milk, was all she had for breakfast. Then her cupboard was empty. But she didn't complain. The Lord had always supplied for her needs in the past, and she was sure that He would help her again. That evening, Martha began to feel very hungry. It would be so wonderful to have a piece of bread before going to bed, she thought. She did not know how it would be possible on such a stormy night. But she had just finished reading a chapter in the Bible. One text was very comforting to her. All things whatsoever you ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Martha knelt beside her bed and prayed for bread. She read these beautiful words again and then repeated her prayer. That evening, Bruce stopped by for some extra groceries on his way home from work. Several friends were coming for dinner the following day. Betty had made a list of items she needed, including 6 loaves of bread. The way home led past his aunt's home. I think I'll just stop by to see if the old lady's still alive, he thought. He got out of the car and walked quietly up to the door. Opening the door just a bit, he peeked into the room just as Aunt Martha closed her eyes to pray for the 3rd time. Bruce stood silently outside her door and listened. Dear Lord, my food's gone, and I'm hungry. You've said in your word that whatsoever we ask in prayer, believing, we shall receive. Would you please give me some bread? Bruce had heard enough. Quietly he returned to the car, chuckling to himself. Here was a great opportunity to play a joke on his aunt. He had always told his friends, when I want something, I have to work for it, but Aunt Martha says she can get things by praying for them. Now he had heard such a prayer. Now he would show her how wrong she was. Taking a loaf of bread from the car, Bruce went back to the house. He quietly slipped inside and placed the loaf on the table. As he drove away, he could picture how Aunt Martha would tell people tomorrow how God had sent her a loaf of bread. Then he could prove to her that he had given her the bread. He could tell her how silly it was to pray to God. I'll just stop there for a moment. Poor stupid Bruce doesn't understand God's ways, does he? It's because he doesn't have a new heart. Bruce doesn't understand what our confession says, that God does all things for us. Every good gift comes down from heaven, but it says that God uses secondary causes or second causes. That means he uses people. And so Bruce didn't realize that God was using him to answer his Aunt Martha's prayer. How sad. Instead of rejoicing and being happy, he was being sinful. And yet God was accomplishing good for one of his children. Martha ended her prayer, opened her eyes, and there on the table was a loaf of bread. With quiet joy she gave thanks to him who was faithful to his promise. The next day, as dinner time approached, Martha received another surprise. Someone in her nephew's car drove up her lane. As she watched, a boy got out and came to the door. He handed her an urgent message. "Aunt Martha, we want you to join us for dinner. Come immediately." Martha didn't know what to think, but changed quickly into her best dress. With some fear, she went with the boy to Bruce's car. The short drive to her nephew's house, however, filled her heart with joy. The beautiful snow lay sparkling on the trees, fences, and rooftops. She no longer troubled herself to wonder why her hateful nephew had called for her. When she entered the house, she was immediately taken to the dining room. Bruce and his family and several friends were already seated at the table. "Well, well, Aunt Martha," her nephew said in a mocking tone, "I thought we should have you come to dinner today so you wouldn't starve." A hot meal was placed before her, and she bowed her head to ask a blessing. Martha could feel that Bruce and his friends were ridiculing her, but she ate her meal, giving thanks in her heart to God. After the meal was finished, Bruce spoke to his aunt again. "So today, at least, you have had a good meal. What about yesterday, Aunt Martha?" Martha looked up and answered sweetly, "I've never been forsaken. The Lord himself provides for his children." "That's what you always say," he snorted. "But how does he provide? Just give me one example if you can." "Well, certainly. Just last night I was fed as miraculously as Elijah was fed by the ravens." Bruce had told his friends about the trick he had pulled on his aunt, so now Bruce and his friends all began to laugh. "Well, tell us about it," Bruce said, glancing around at his friends with a smirk. Aunt Martha looked up bravely and told him everything that had happened. "Last night I had nothing left in the house to eat. I was very hungry, so I asked the Lord to send me some bread. I prayed for a long time, but at last I arose from my knees. I'm sure you will only laugh, but there on the table was a loaf of bread. I divided that loaf into 3 parts so it would last me for 3 days. I thanked God with every bite I took from my first portion." Now Bruce broke out into laughter. "But I'm the one you should thank. I placed that loaf of bread on your table myself." Now all of his friends joined him in laughter. After the laughter had died down, Martha looked at her nephew and calmly said, "Elijah did not thank the ravens, Bruce." Sudden silence fell the room. Bruce flushed in anger and muttered, "You're just an old hypocrite. Just go home. I hope you never see you again." With quiet dignity, Martha replied, "I would not have come if you hadn't invited me, Bruce. I thank you for what you've given me. For the rest you must answer to God." So saying, she quietly left the room. As she reached for a coat, however, Betty joined her. "Let me help you with your coat." Soon several guests respectfully gathered around her too. How sorry they were to have made fun of this godly woman. Seeing how things had turned out, Bruce ordered the car to be brought. Martha was driven home in comfort. The Lord richly blessed Martha's testimony of faith. The next morning Betty came to Martha's home and said, "I was so impressed with what I heard you say at the table yesterday. Won't you please pray for me? I'm such a sinful person. I miss what you have. Please teach me how to pray." Martha's heart was filled with humble gratitude to God. She prayed that the Lord would guide her in explaining to Betty the way of salvation which the Holy Spirit works in the hearts of needy sinners. There we are. Another one of those wonderful stories taken from life. God's people cared for by God Himself through other people, even when those other people may not know that they're following the Lord and His guidance, but He just moves them where He will. You know, the scriptures say that He controls the hearts of kings just like He moves the water streams. And so it is with His providence. He takes care of everything from the greatest to the least, and particularly, our confession says, His providence is for His people. They get a special dose of it, as it were. And so we saw it in this lesson. Well, God bless you. I be back next week, Lord willing, and we'll see where we go from here at the end of Book 3. God bless.